This is part two of Transitions and Conflict in Central America. And in part one, I was just concluding by discussing the idea that there's a pan-Central American sense of opposition to the status quo. And that returns us to one of the questions I organized the class around. Is there a unified Latin American identity? What we can see here is that there is a unified sense of objection to the way the liberal economic order was working out, the way there was no political liberalism, and tacked onto that was a growing opposition in a place like Central America of opposition to the domination of the United States. And that, of course, was also influenced somewhat by the Mexican Revolution and its highly nationalistic 1917 Constitution, which tried to limit the role of foreign capital. So when we look at Sandino and we look at Martí, we can see a growth of a kind of pan-Central American identity. I do want to point out that these guys, although shared some ideas, they were very different. Martí returned to El Salvador and founded the Salvadoran Communist Party. Sandino was very, very much not a communist. He was a nationalist who was very uncomfortable with communists, and he and Martí openly disagreed about this. They wrote letters back and forth, which have been since published. Now, what's interesting about that is when we get to the 1970s and 80s, the Salvadoran and Nicaraguan revolutionary movements are very different. The Nicaraguans, who name themselves for Sandino, the Sandinistas, are much more nationalist than they are Marxist, and they certainly aren't communists. They're opposed by the communists. But the Salvadorans are, and they have the Farabunda Martí National Liberation Front. That guerrilla movement is very far left-wing and very influenced by a communist politics. So this division that takes place in the late 1920s and early 1930s plays out 40 and 50 years later. Well, Martí, when he returns to El Salvador to organize opposition, he does it in the context of the Great Depression. With the great decline in coffee and other commodity prices, the economy is a complete shambles. There's just really no money around. And it's in this context that there's going to be an election in 1931. The then president, Pío Romero Bosque, was very much tied to the ruling Melendez-Quinones clan. But he was pressured primarily by middle-class reformers and many urban types to hold elections in 1931. There were 6 candidates running, and a landowner, but not a right-wing landowner, a real reformer named Arturo Araujo. He won. And he was, for lack of a better term, a very sincere Democrat. He believed that in a democracy, everyone should be able to participate. Now, what does that mean? I say here on the slide that he was Mexico's version of Madero, in the sense that he was very, very progressive, and he believed in a U.S.-style democracy. And he said, look, if the communists are organized and they want to participate in elections, they should participate. That's what we do in a democracy. And so he allowed all political parties to operate openly, and he allowed communist candidates to stand for municipal elections. This was just too much for the 14 families, and so working with them, the military moved to get rid of the elected president. And in fact, they did remove him. And a general, Maximiliano Hernández Martínez, took control of the government. Now, one of the things that Hernández Martínez did is he was quite clever. And even though he overthrew the elected government, he chose not to end the municipal elections. He said we should have the elections that Araujo had planned that were coming up for 1932. Now, the Communist Party kind of took a 2-track plan to this. On the one hand, they would put candidates up for electoral office. But on the other hand, they were going to organize an anti-military uprising around these elections. So they're planning for a coup and they're running for office. They scheduled the uprising for 22nd January 1932. Now, what's important to understand is communist parties were completely subservient to the orders of Moscow. Now, that sounds like something some right-winger would say, but it's a historical fact that the Communist Party in Moscow would decide what the Latin American Communist Party should do, and it would send an order to the Communist Party of the United States, the CPUSA, and its headquarters in New York. And then the CPUSA would send a telegram to the Salvadoran Communist Party, the Brazilian, and tell them what to do. And it's really how it worked. And we know this because all the archives are open. And the communists ordered that the Russians ordered that this coup take place. And so part of what was going on also is that the United States and the British governments were very good at intercepting these telegrams and then informing local governments of what was going on. And so the military knew exactly what was going to happen, and it used the elections to figure out who was in opposition. So they let the elections go on, and they let the uprising go forward, knowing that they could arrest all of their opponents. What happened was the communists had worked very hard to organize rural workers for the uprising, and when urban communists realized that the military knew what was going to happen, they pulled back, but they never told their rural allies. And there was a big peasant uprising in the Western Coffee Zone led by peasant leaders, people who we use this colonial term, caciques, who are kind of middlemen between the urban and the rural. Peasants rebelled, they invaded coffee estates, they took over government buildings, they killed about 100 people, including 35 civilians. And private militias based on these coffee estates, along with the army, responded with absolutely horrific levels of repression. They went in and they just killed everyone. The best estimate is about 30,000 peasants were murdered. I've seen an estimate of 32,000. Most of the estimates are in the low 30,000 range. It's an extraordinary number of people killed, and it made up 2% of El Salvador's entire population. The retaliation for these 100 deaths, 100 people, 100 white people or people tied to white people, was killing 30,000+ people who seemed racially different, Indians and mestizos. The retaliation was very, very racial and cultural and class-based. Anyone who dressed in traditional Indian garb or who seemed Indian might just be murdered on the spot. There was no rhyme or reason to the military's retaliation other than this kind of racial hatred of anyone who seemed Indian or mestizo. Indeed, after the uprising in 1932 and after the matanza, or the slaughter as it's known, of all these people, Indian dress was literally legally prohibited. And that was an attempt at a kind of cultural genocide to destroy what had happened. And that's important, right? This is the early 1930s into the mid-1930s, and this is exactly when, if you think of last lecture, when Mexico is celebrating indigenousness, when painters like Rivera and Orozco and people throughout other parts of Central America are saying, no, this kind of very narrow-minded 19th century white vision of modernity is wrong, and that we Latin Americans are much more complicated people. Well, in El Salvador, that clock is being turned back, and being turned back very, very violently. So this is really about very much a kind of failed transition. The 19th and early 20th centuries political order of very limited rule by a few with a very vibrant export economy, that all falls apart with the advent of the Great Depression. And in the next lecture, we're going to see how these changes, these economic changes in the world trading system affected Argentina and Chile and Brazil. But in Central America, there was an attempt by the leading opposition group in El Salvador, the communists, to change everything. And the problem was that by failing, they opened the door to the restoration of that old order of very narrow political system and absolute free trade. And the post-1932 governments in El Salvador were even worse than the ones that preceded them because they were constantly in fear of popular uprising. They weren't going to do anything to reform politics. They were just going to smash any opposition. And we finally see a challenge to that in the mid to late 1970s and through the 1980s with the rise of the Farabundo Martí Liberation Front, National Liberation Front. That's what the N is in FMLN, which is finally challenging this. But it takes years because the Salvadoran elite, working with the United States and others, is so ruthless in maintaining keeping its thumb on things and just grinding people down anytime they try to oppose it. But we are going to look in the next lecture at some more successful challenges to the status quo that grow out of the Great Depression.